that's okay.
Thanks, Matt. Like Matt said, I'm Tony, and this is Matt. We're from Don't Panic Labs in Lincoln. Don't Panic Labs, we're primarily a consulting shop. We also offer educational services. We have a software design class that we have partnered with lots of companies in the area to put on. Today, what we kind of wanted to talk about was being .NET developers in AWS, because as a company, we definitely have a preference towards Microsoft's products, towards Microsoft's platform, but we are also a consulting shop, and customers bring to us requirements, and sometimes one of those requirements is we're already in AWS, or we need to be in AWS, or my friend told us we should be in AWS, so that's where we want to host our stuff. So while the bulk of our projects are Azure, and we still lean towards Azure, we've done a significant amount of product development in AWS with AWS's products. So we kind of wanted to give some of our experiences, compare and contrast some things. Matt's going to talk about all the good stuff he's done, and then I'm going to be a rain cloud about lambdas, but that's okay.
So yeah, and to kind of further like what Tony's talking about, with us doing consulting work, we turn through 30 to 40 projects every year, and so some of those are with new customers, some of them are repeat customers, and so we see a wide variety of projects with a ton of different requirements going on with all of them. So to give you an idea of like my experience with AWS, I really started working on AWS stuff about 6.5 years ago. I was working on a corporate wellness project, and we didn't have a whole lot of direction from the client at that time other than it needed to run in AWS. And so being new to doing cloud development, there wasn't a whole lot of services that AWS was offering at that point in time. It was more of infrastructure as a service. As time has gone on, obviously both Azure and AWS have started doing more platform as a service, which is hugely beneficial, but this is more of infrastructure as a service. And so we were using EC2 servers or EC2 instances to run as our servers. We were doing load balancing and autoscale group to handle all the traffic and everything like that. The deployments were awful for us because it was a very manual process. We had to take compiler code, put it into a zip file, copy that zip file, and do a remote desktop into a server, deploy the code to that server that wasn't actually even in our running mix of servers, power the server down, go in and say, okay, we need to make an image of this server so that we can create a new auto-scaling group so that when the load balancer says we've had enough traffic, we need to spin up a new instance. It was awful. It took anywhere from half an hour to 45 minutes just to walk through that manual process. And then there was another 10 or 15 minutes waiting for the new servers to spin up before we could spin the old servers down. It was not pleasant at all. Fortunately, Amazon has improved that process a lot with the Elastic Beanstalk, but this was really before Elastic Beanstalk was in existence and before support of the .NET platform. So we're also using their SCS for the simple email service for sending out all of our emails. This was any sort of automated reports that were going out through the system, or even simple things like forgot username and password kind of emails that we were sending. The configuration was great and easy there because we didn't have to worry about all of the signing of the email messages or anything like that. Since this was a corporate wellness platform, they wanted it to feel kind of like Strava, like community kind of feel to it. So they would let users upload their own images, and they were white labeling this product out to different corporations. And so we were using S3 for doing all of our image storage and storing any of our content like CSS or basic styling for that. And then we were using RDS with their relational database service with SQL Server. And at that point in time, it was great because we didn't have to worry about managing another EC2 instance with figuring out keeping SQL Server patched and everything like that. But getting data in and out of that instance was terrible because they hadn't yet built out the platforms for being able to import or export back files. So you really had no way to, like if your data was in there, migrating it out was going to be really painful. So that was, I said that was 2013, 2014. So then, that product is still running in AWS. We had looked at trying to migrate it over to Elastic Beanstalk, but the client actually just built out their internal DevOps team, and so they transitioned over to using the CloudFormation and building out templates for every time there's a new deployment. They're using CloudFormation to handle all of that. So that was the longest time, that was like my experience with AWS. And then beginning of 2018, had another client come on that they were building out a mobile app. They had already had the mobile app built by another third party. It was written in Ionic. What they needed to do on our side of things was they needed us to build out a custom OAuth server for them so that they could let their clients log into the app and use their same credentials they were using for their bill pay system. And their bill pay system had, a very simple API in front of it, and that was it. So at that point, we were able to use Elastic Beanstalk to build out a web app that was using the Identity Server 4 to do the authentication, and then we used Lambdas to build out a custom authorizer and an API, and those were running just completely serverless, and we fronted the API with the API gateway. And so then the API gateway was able to use the custom authorizer and validate the OAuth tokens that were coming from the OAuth server that we built. So that was great. And then the other thing that we did on that project is we started using CloudWatch, which is their logging platform. And using CloudWatch has been great because we're able to store a vast amount of server traces. We don't have to figure out which server the traces came from or anything like that. The CloudWatch is handling all of that for us automatically. It's threading them together. The searching through traces is fabulous. And the other thing that it's allowed us to do is, as we're doing a support contract for this client now, is on a weekly basis going in and checking the logs, for any exceptions that might be happening. We're also able to get a little bit of data as far as like how many user authentications are happening and the general health. And so we're able to build a custom dashboard to get quick insights into those key metrics for us out of CloudWatch. And then earlier this year, had a company come to us. They were building a HIPAA application, HTML app, and they really just needed our expertise on getting what they were building running in the cloud and for it to be HIPAA compliant. And so we worked with them. The front end was just a static HTML website. I don't remember if they're using Angular or Ionic. I honestly don't remember what they're using for the front end, but it all compiled down to static HTML and JavaScript. And then on the back end, they had built everything out using Ruby on Rails. And so what we were able to do for them was, again, use Elastic Beanstalk, and it ran just the exact same way that Elastic Beanstalk runs for .NET. It just, you get to go in and switch over from using everything on Windows server over to a Linux server, and say that you're using the Ruby runtime. It was really easy. As far as hosting their static HTML and JavaScript for the web front end, we put all that into S3, and then through S3, we used CloudFront to act as their CDN for all of that content. And so that pushes out that static HTML out to, since they're only dealing with clients here in the US, we only pushed out to the US endpoints on their CDN network. But as we pushed new updates for the HTML web app, it was super easy just to tell CloudFront to go in and invalidate the data that it had pushed out to the Edge network and pull the latest. And with it, their Ruby on Rails backend, we again built out the API gateway and had to set up the cores for that. So that was a little painful trying to configure up the API gateway to use cores, and Tony's, that'll be one of his complaints that he wants to rain on my parade, is that the cores is not an easy thing to configure and maintain. But yeah, so then with the API gateway, we were able to set up different stages for their development and production environments just through a single configuration, and then map any of the incoming requests, the URLs and everything like that, we were able to map to different backend endpoints. So that was really helpful, and yeah, we used Elastic Beanstalk, and then they were using an RDS Postgres database, and so with that they're able to still be HIPAA compliant because that database is by default you can turn on always on encryption with encryption at rest and encrypted connections, and we had the database so it was only accessible within the virtual private cloud. So with it being accessible only within that virtual private cloud, you know, there was no ways to poke a hole through the firewall to get in to connect to that. You can't access it through a public IP address or anything. And then, so that was earlier this year, and then most recently I've been working on an iOS native app, you know, built entirely on Swift, and then the back end we have built with .NET Core. I do all my development on Mac, which is great for doing iOS app development. .NET Core, you know, has been great to be able to take that and still deploy that over to the Elastic Beanstalk. And we've built a couple of Lambdas out for scheduled tasks that need to happen, like on a nightly basis, where we have reports that need to get sent out. We're able to use a scheduler, execute a Lambda function, and send those out. Yeah, we used Elastic Beanstalk for the web app and web API. So the web app is, you know, handling a little bit of functionality for people who don't have the mobile app, or if they're on Android, they can still get in and access some of that functionality. And then the web API, we put the API gateway out in front of that again. The API gateway for this, since we didn't need to do a whole lot of custom mapping or anything like that, we're able to go through and proxy, just tell it to proxy all of the requests through the API gateway straight over to our web API on the back end. So that made it a lot easier. We were also using the Dynamo as a NoSQL data store. It's been really easy. There's a few gotchas with the Dynamo database because within your instance or within your AWS subscription, you only have one instance of Dynamo. You know, we're used to using things like, what is it, Tony?
Cosmos DB,
Yeah, like Cosmos.
SQL Azure, having these multiple, you know, environment management in AWS is probably one of my biggest complaints. Having prod, QA, dev live in a single AWS account and logically separate those is not, in a lot of cases, it's not possible. You have to have a separate AWS account for each environment for a lot of the services, and I dislike it very much. I dislike that aspect very much.
But Dynamo itself is easy. It is ridiculously cheap. You know, you've got on-demand provisioning for your resources, so you know it's all usage-based for the pricing on it. You know, accessing it isn't a whole lot different than accessing anything through the Entity Framework. It's just, you know, you have a couple of descriptors that you're telling the code, like what table you're hitting in your single Dynamo instance. Then we also used the RDS Aurora, and for the RDS Aurora we were using the MySQL database, but you know, it's again, there's nothing really special there. And yeah, we're using that for all of our relational data. And one thing that I tried to do with this app was I tried to use the AWS Amplify, which is supposed to be their platform for really being able to build out like your mobile app and abstract all of the difficulties. I ended up scrapping that and using the Microsoft App Center for doing all of our logging, our analytics, and our push notifications. To do the configuration with Microsoft App Center was really me getting an API key to App Center, pulling in a package, and running with that. So that was really my one complaint with trying to do any sort of mobile app development, was that the infrastructure around doing that stuff in AWS just didn't seem like it was very good.
I have more than one complaint. Late last year, I was on a project. This was my first large-scale AWS project I'd ever done, and we went all in AWS serverless. It was every serverless product you could imagine on their marketing materials, and we did it. It was an IoT project. There's one buzzword. So we had an IoT project, completely serverless environment. It's actually managing brewing tanks, fermenting tanks at microbreweries. It was really cool. They came to us with a functioning prototype. So in some ways, this was a lot like a legacy project. So we had this AWS baggage come with it, and they had already done a bunch of work. The main app was the API gateway backed by Lambdas. So every single API gateway endpoint had a JavaScript Lambda backing it, handling all of the requests. We used Cloud9, the cloud-based IDE, to do all the Lambda development and deployments. We used Dynamo for our data storage. It's very good most of the time, except I can't have a QA and a prod. I have one DynamoDB, which was infuriating. We use Cognito. That's their authentication service for getting tokens back and handling user authentication. We used Amplify, and it was an Ionic mobile app we built, so it was cross-platform, and we used Amplify to handle some of our Cognito requests and do our general HTTP requests. And we built it, we built a really good product, we got it done, but the amount of developer pain doing it that way, we have a project in mind internally of how can we do this a good way? How can we do this the right way? If we had to do this project, this exact project again, what would we change? And how would we do it correctly? We haven't solved that problem yet. But we know it's coming. A lot of people use AWS. A lot of customers are going to want to use AWS. We think it's a problem worth solving. We're not quite there yet. So the things that got me, environment management is really painful. Coming from Azure, I built a lot of stuff in Azure. Being able to have QA and prod dev instances of all of my services is a piece of cake. Microsoft does that so well. They think that way, right? AWS does not think that way. Get a new account, put it in a different region, whatever you have to do. That's how you're going to segment your services. Microsoft talks about this concept of helping developers fall into the pit of success. And you do not. In my experience, it's not that you can't be successful with AWS. You can obviously be successful with AWS and have incredibly successful projects come out of it, but you don't fall into that success. There's a lot of work to get there.
Deployments.
Deployments.
Yeah. So that's one of the other things is doing any sort of continuous deployments through AWS is, I'm sure it can be done, but with the projects I was working on, we found it much easier just to, most people who do DevOps stuff will cringe when they hear this, but in Visual Studio, just making sure I've got the master branch pulled down and then right-click, deploy to AWS, and You know, that's,
They provide really good templates to do that.
Yeah.
Like, they have some pretty awesome AWS extensions, but that's not how I want to run a development pipeline. That's not the life cycle I would want to have for this stuff.
Yeah, they also have a lot of CLI tools, but again, you know, if you're doing builds, like, you know, if you're running Azure DevOps and you're just using the hosted DevOps build servers and deploy servers, you aren't going to have the AWS CLI installed on those. And so if you do want that installed, then, you know, there's extra stuff you have to do to get those installed, and so then it just, you know, exacerbates the amount of time it takes to do like your deploy pipelines and things
Right.
like that.
Yeah. You know, a lot of the services between Azure and AWS are pretty comparable. Matt says that Azure's API gateway management is terrible. I'm going to take him at his word. I haven't done that yet. We've really been... So, one thing we liked about Lambdas. Well, the biggest thing we didn't like is that AWS's solution when you start down this road is, how do I do this? Well, write another Lambda. Oh, use a Lambda to handle that message. Trigger this off of a Lambda. Oh, you can write a Lambda to fill in this part of your pipeline. We started this project thinking 12, we can manage 12. And we ended up with over 20 by the end. And by the time you're at 20 Lambdas all written in plain JavaScript, that's not, and you know it's not going to end, right? It's not going to stop at 20. If this is a successful product and a successful company, it's going to be 30 someday. And that doesn't scale.
And even, you know, to speak to those, like, you know, if you're doing the Lambda functions in .NET, you still end up having that same number of functions because the project is literally just a function that has a special header on it that, you know, you can use to pass in some parameters.
Except Azure, Microsoft made the function app project type, which puts all of your functions, all of these nice serverless functions, under a single CS proj file for configuration and deployment and management. So
For
they
Azure.
are for Azure.
Yeah.
So they are thinking about this. So we've really been looking at that. We really liked the serverless for obvious reasons, which is consumption-based billing, right? I mean, that's always the winner, is if I say, oh, I can build you a solution in AWS, and you are literally only going to get a bill for what you use, period. That is too attractive of a message to throw all of this out the window and say, no, we're just going to do it the way we know we can do it and the way we want to do it. So we're trying to find a way to get that benefit without all of these other headaches.
And AWS does that, or Amazon does have a template for building your whole .NET Core MVC web API and running it through a Lambda. I just don't have any experience doing that yet, but they say it is possible to publish a whole MVC web app through a Lambda and access it that way. So it seems kind of like a little bit of a head scratcher. As Tony and I were driving up, you know, we're trying to think about, like, how do they do this? You know, are they actually spinning up the whole web server and having that listening there for the request and running through the whole request pipeline and then tearing that down when they're done? Or are they doing some other magic? We don't know. So that will be something that, you know, as opportunity permits, to dig into that a little bit and understand how that works. So, or at least understand how well it works.
Right,
I know
right.
Is the average page response time, you know, 10 or 15 milliseconds, or is it, you know, 150 milliseconds just to spin things up? You know, that
Yeah.
we don't know.
If your traffic's low enough, does every start a cold start? Are you suffering that pain every single time? Dynamo, I want to talk about Dynamo because I have a love-hate relationship with Dynamo because it's non-relational storage, which is really great, and we're trying to use more of that because not every piece of data is relational, and you don't have to make 7 tables in a SQL server to store every single object. Microsoft has Cosmos DB. Has anybody here used Cosmos on a project for non-relational storage? And like use the Storage Explorer to just browse your documents and query through stuff? You don't get that with Dynamo. They have a web interface, and the queries are not great, and it's really hard to work with your data, but it is so cheap. It can be almost free compared to Cosmos, which is definitely not cheap. If there's one thing I would want Azure to make, it is a Cosmos Lite. you know, fine, I'll give up a little performance, give me that non-relational store with a little less performance for a fraction of the price. I would use it all the time, but
Yeah.
and Dynamo strikes a balance.
Yeah, so some of the nice things, you know, that I'm sitting here like kind of reflecting, is the API gateway. I really enjoyed the API gateway in AWS. It will let you, like as you're setting up your API gateway, you can have it just proxy all of your requests straight through to your back end. And then like, you know, as you're developing a new service, but you know, your front end devs need, you know, mocks of that, you can actually build out like individual mocks for single calls and have it just return like that mocked JSON data for you. It can return some different responses based upon like inputs to it through those mocks. So that's been very interesting. You can also set up lambdas to be executed through the API gateway. So, you know, it isn't just having to have respond directly to an event or anything like that. Although I guess maybe receiving a request is an event that's happening from the API gateway. Or you can do some crazy mappings to like, you know, sending requests off to different web servers that aren't even necessarily things that are running within your own infrastructure or even within your own like purview. So that is one great thing about the API gateway. If I had a complaint about it, is that as you're going in and configuring it, it can get really complicated. You know, when you have, you know, 15 or 20 different API endpoints that you're having to configure in there, what I ended up finding is like as I'm getting to the bottom and I need to, their menus don't float, so it's a thing of like, you know, I'm clicking down here and then I have to scroll all the way back up to the top to make my menu choice and then go back down to scroll. And so that's difficult. The other thing is that if you make any mistakes as you're like putting in your endpoints, if like say you have a typo, you just get to delete that and recreate a new one. They don't have any way to edit your endpoints as you're configuring them. So that's kind of a bummer.
And there's not a good way to duplicate that API between two environments. So if I set all this up in QA, great, put that API in prod for me. I can export a Swagger. I can get the basic structure of my API, but I still have to go through the jungle of drop-down menus and radio buttons and saving and publishing, and it's not, it's the reason people automate a release, is so a human doesn't screw it up, right? Like, people make mistakes, people are the reason there are problems going to prod. You can't automate the whole thing. We had bugs introduced to production because we forgot a checkbox, because we forgot a drop-down menu, because we had 20 different endpoints on our REST API.
Yeah,
And that is...
It will let you, like as you have configured your API gateway, they have the concept of stages, so you can have like a QA, or like a dev, a QA, and a prod stage, which sounds great, but the problem is that you only have one definition of what your API model looks like. And so if you've gone in and like, you know, you have whatever's running in production and you need to go in and, you know, you've been updating it with whatever your next release that's on QA, and you have some change that has to get hotfixed for, you know, a data element or something like that that's in prod, you don't have a way to go in and pull up our current prod configuration and just change that. You're changing the whole model and then publishing that to a stage. So they don't give you any good way of versioning those.
Also, if my stage API is supposed to hit my stage Dynamo, that lives in a different AWS account. That doesn't get to live in the same place, so I still can't manage that.
Some of the nice things that I have found with AWS, as well as setting up permissions between like the different services that are running. So through your IAM console, which is where you handle all of the permissions, you can build out like either individual specific keys, or you can just say like, hey, anything that's running like within this server, if it's assigned this role, can do, like it can go and read this S3 bucket for storage, but it can't read any other S3 bucket for storage. And so that is very powerful. It takes a little bit of time to get used to handling configuration that way, as opposed to having to remember all of the magic strings and keys, and which is something that happens in Azure quite a bit with, oh, well, we've got this set of keys for, talking to this service for production.
Speaking of IAM accounts, if you've used the Azure portal frequently, user management and permissions are not perfect, but they're pretty good. In AWS, if you have multiple accounts, you are going to have separate physical IAM accounts in every environment. I mean, their best practices are, if I have this account for prod and this account for QA, I'm going and creating distinct separate users in QA. And I'm sending them emails and they're setting up passwords. And I hope if somebody quits or if somebody gets fired, you know how to go track down all of those IAM accounts that you set up, 18 months ago, and deactivate those, which is a discussion we're having, like how are we going to manage this as we go. This is not as simple as logging into my Active Directory for my organization for my Azure subscriptions. I'm going to shut somebody's account off. They're done. That user management just doesn't work.
Yeah, or even like if we decide that we're going to fire Tony tomorrow and we just deactivate his Active Directory account, then it's disabled across every single Azure subscription he had access to. Whereas with AWS, there is nothing like that exists.
I can just go to my OneNote page that has a list of 10 IAM accounts in it, because that's what I have to do with my generated passwords to log into all those different login consoles.
Because Tony doesn't believe in LastPass, apparently.
I'm too cheap to pay for LastPass.
It's free. So, do you have anything more to cover?
No, we were really hoping to generate some questions, because we've got blood on the floor. So if you guys have anything you're curious about or you haven't done firsthand, anything you wanted to know about, we were really hoping to open it up.
Yeah, if you want us to compare or contrast between like something that you do in AWS or that you do in Azure and like are wondering how it might be done in AWS, we can hopefully answer those.
You mentioned a cost Cosmos.
Yeah.
What kind of charges are you seeing with Cosmos? Did you like think of any ways to reconfigure your setup so you could charge so much?
Well, it's even with Cosmos, though, just your base cost, right? They charge by the RU, the resource unit, and so I want to say I haven't checked. About the cheapest you can do is $20 a month, and I realize that is not a huge depending on where you work, depending on what your business is. Either that's peanuts, but we work with a lot of startups who are cash strapped, and they do not want to pay that over a course of how many months of development. That's a monthly bill, and that eats into, every month that eats into the little bit of cash they are investing in this thing we're trying to build. Also, storage is pretty limited in Cosmos. You get what, 10 gigs at the base level, and then you pay precipitously. Some of these specific numbers may have changed. I mean, Azure is tweaking these services all the time, right? But I can compare that to Dynamo, where if I go set up my Dynamo account and we don't get to using it until next month, I paid $0. $0 on the credit card, period. So when you're talking about really resource-sensitive customers, it's a difference, and across all of the different services you would need to stand up and pay a subscription for, it can add up. It can add up to real percentages of what they have to invest at this stage of their business, right?
And Dynamo's also saving you money since you don't have separate QA and dev.
Oh, yeah. Right. You just prefix all your table names. Right, don't do that.
Kind of along those lines, like the API gateway. Now I know Azure right now is, I think they're in a preview for resource-based billing on the API gateway, but up until like a month or two ago, like the base instance of running an API gateway, I think the cost on that was like $100 a month, which is quite a bit for just like, passing through requests if that's what you're looking to do. So at least when I looked at it, but the resource-based usage is going to be great. So I'm looking forward to being able to tap into that.
Yeah. Azure is chasing the serverless train. AWS went there right away. Azure's getting there. They're getting those comparable services.
What about for local dev? How do you guys do that? When you want to isolate developers from one another, you got a team of 100 developers or something crazy, right? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, how do I do that? Okay. That was one of our so we did JavaScript lambdas. So what does AWS's knowledge base say? Use Cloud9. So you log into Cloud9 and they fire up an EC2 instance and you're actually editing your code in a web page. Okay, so I have this environment set up and I'm deploying directly from there to my lambdas where they need to be. And great, I need a second dev. I'm going to share my development environment with dev number 2. Cool, they can see everything I can see. We've got this going. Yeah, we're both developing. This is awesome. Saturday comes around. This really happened to me multiple times. I get a message, hey, I need you to go log into Cloud9 because it says you're the owner of the account and you have to be logged in order for me to log into Cloud9 and work today because I'm trying to make up some time on the weekend. And we did that for like 2 months. And once again, I am sure there's a solution to that problem. I'm 100% confident there's a way around that, but that's not the default place you end up with in AWS.
And so Tony's speaking from the JavaScript side. Since this is the .NET users group, I'll bring it back to the C# side of things.
How do you run Cognito locally?
I don't know about Cognito, but for like the lambdas you can run those locally. Through Visual Studio, you can either when you template out like a new project that's using a Lambda, it will scaffold out a unit test project for you that will execute that Lambda. And so you can pass in and run unit tests through it, or you can just F5 and start running right through your Lambda. Now, responding, like if you're building Lambdas that are responding to events, like, oh, a new S3 file was created and we're handling that, I don't know about debugging those, but on the API side, like if you're building on an API that's running through a Lambda, that's how you handle that.
I do know that AWS, and we've looked into this, you can get a Docker container of DynamoDB and run that locally.
Yep.
I believe you can get a Docker container of API Gateway,
Yeah.
but I don't think that Docker container has the configuration UI, or maybe Dynamo doesn't have the configuration UI. So the web interface you would normally use to manage DynamoDB doesn't come with the container you would download. It would all be programmatic access at that point through the APIs. What was the other thing we had? We had local development was a serious challenge.
Yeah, these are issues you have some with Azure as well.
Yeah.
Some, and even then, okay, I have the bulk of my code running in Visual Studio. Sometimes it's just easier to hit a storage account rather than run the storage emulator locally. Like we make those decisions too in the .NET world. And also, I think Azure now offers a Cosmos DB Docker container to run locally, which is awesome. And I wish they had had that 3 years ago when I was heavily developing Cosmos. That would have helped a lot.
What other support besides the knowledge base was available?
A lot of out-of-date stuff with weird versions.
Yeah.
Google?
Yeah, I mean Stack Overflow, of course. I mean, a lot of people use it. You're not, a lot of people use AWS. You're not the first person to have this problem, right?
But Amazon doesn't really.
No, Amazon's documentation is awful. It's hard to navigate your way through anything that AWS is putting out there.
No 1-800 numbers to dial.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sure if your subscription is at the right level, you can get somebody on the phone.
But that's where, like I was talking earlier, like when I was setting up that mobile app and I wanted to do push notifications, And I tried to struggle my way through the Amplify stuff. The documentation was not anywhere at all helping me, so I just gave up and switched over to using Map Center.
More than the documentation being bad, it's inconsistent. It's, you know, some stuff is pretty thoroughly documented and some stuff it's like, we have this. Yep, this is one of our products. So it's really frustrating to even know when you should go look.
So are they basically just winning on price? I mean, they're the leader.
They're incumbent, they're cheaper generally. I think, you know, Microsoft has been saying this, Microsoft is still more platform and Amazon is still more infrastructure, and you can see that in everything they do. And I think there's a lot of people who want infrastructure as a service. They want that, or they think they want that. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, so like, you know, to what Tony's saying there, like when I start up a new Elastic Beanstalk instance and, you know, when I'm configuring that and, you know, I'm saying, oh, I want it to be running a minimum of 2 servers and scaling up, in the background, it's creating all of those EC2 instances and the auto scaling group and the load balancers. And when I'm navigating through the console and I look at EC2 instances, those EC2 instances just show up right there. It, you know, as opposed to like if you're using,
There's no abstraction, they're
Yeah.
not hiding that from you. I think another big thing is, let's not forget, today you can run a lot of different platforms and languages and technologies in Azure, and that's actually really new. You know, AWS, you run whatever you want. Since they started, you know, if I want to write Python, if I want to run a PHP app, if I want to run this stuff, they've always had that. This is new territory for Microsoft, and it's definitely, they don't have this reputation, right? If I want to now, I love SQL Azure databases because I don't ever want to manage my SQL database again. I don't ever want to manage my backups, and I even let it auto-tune my queries sometimes because that's amazing. Just recently now you can get MySQL, which I don't recommend, but you can get it. They have Postgres now offered as a hosted database. Like Microsoft is making these plays, and now you can write functions, the equivalent of lambdas, in, you know, Python's in preview. They've had Node.js for quite a while now. Of course you have C#. But if I wanted to do non-Microsoft development, it wasn't that long ago, I really didn't have a choice except to go to AWS.
you know, I think one of the encouraging things about using the AWS platform is, like with the Lambdas and serverless stuff, there have been people out there that have run benchmarks, and .NET Core Lambdas are the fastest performing Lambdas out of any of the languages. They benchmarked, I think it was like C#, Python, Ruby, Go, and Java, and it beat all of those, you know, even the interpreted stuff, it was the fastest. So that's, you know, one thing that's exciting as a .NET developer is seeing that, you know, Amazon is actually investing in, you know, running things well on their platform.
What about resource groups? Does Amazon have anything that's similar?
They do have resource
You can
groups.
tag things.
Yeah, I mean, you can put things into resource groups, but I've never done it.
You've never done it.
Not in AWS, because, you know, we aren't, like most of the projects that we're building out, we're not running at the scale where we've got, you know, all these different services that, I guess that is one thing, like, you know, in Azure, you can go in and you can go and look and see all of my resources. AWS, at least as far as I know, doesn't have a all my resources tab to it, you know, so they don't have a way to see all of your resources. If you want to look at your EC2 instances, you have to go to EC2, and then when you want to look at API Gateway, you have to go to API Gateway and manage all those things all separately. There isn't a unified interface to get to those, so.
And that's why browsers have tabs.
Yeah. So yeah, they did, but Amazon does offer a way to group those resources, and I assume that that grouping of resources is probably, so like as you're setting up the IAM security roles and things like that, that you can assign users only access to resources that are within a certain resource group, but, you know, where we're where we end up being DevOps and IT for a lot of these startups that we're working with, you know, we don't have to worry about that.
How did you guys get, like, when you were first learning it? I mean, you said you kind of complained about the documentation, so how did you get started? Because I think about 5 years ago, I probably got the free $250 or whatever and digged around with it or whatever, and it was just kind of like, a little too much effort needed here to do too much, and I didn't need it, so.
You've blazed a lot of trails,
Yeah.
figuring out how to do, you've had more reps. We had a workable prototype delivered for this serverless, this IoT app we did, right? They had, maybe everything wasn't written the best and things were prototypey, but we had this thing that worked that we could sort of refactor and clean up a little bit and figure out how to make this a little bit better, and then along the way, you kind of figure out slightly better ways to do it. But you've gone through a ton of different ways of
Yeah.
setting stuff up.
A lot of it is honestly trial and error and just feeling the pain. You know, so when Tony said we've had a lot of blood on the floor, there's been like days where like nothing was accomplished because we're trying to figure out how to get, you know, with working with Beanstalk, how to get it to handle the Ruby on Rails with, you know, this configuration. And, you know, it's just a lot of back and forth, like clicking different buttons until you finally figure out, oh, this was the right combination of settings to get it to work. You know, once you have that, then it's easy to spin up another one, you know, another set of instances like that. And something that Amazon does, you know, so I kind of briefly touched upon it with the Wellness platform where the client has moved to using CloudFormation. CloudFormation, you can build out YAML templates to build out your whole environment for you. And so once you have like an environment that is repeatable to, you know that it's in a good working state and you want to be able to repeat that, you can scaffold that out as YAML, save that, and so then, you know, as you need to build out another environment that's a clone of it, you just give it that YAML file and you go. So that is one way, you know, you don't have to worry about, okay, I'm doing this through their terrible UI and I clicked the right or wrong button.
Does anybody here use the resource management automation in Azure? You know how like every single service in Azure has that, it'll basically generate you a script of how to reproduce that thing?
The ARM templates?
Yes.
Yeah.
Is that how those work?
It's similar, yeah. But they're, a lot of time you end up with the same kind of situation where you just
Okay,
experimentation with it.
That's always been one of those things I thought, like, wow, what if I could just script this whole thing?
Honestly, I think the CLI is a bit better.
Okay, that's what I thought.
That's my opinion.
That's kind of where I was landing, but I didn't.
Yeah, and AWS does have a CLI to handle a lot of stuff as well. I just, you know, again, their documentation isn't very good, so I
Yeah.
haven't spent the time to try and delve into it and learn it.
Yeah, for like environment provisioning right now, I was like, I should probably just, if I knew what my environment was, I would just script it. I would just write a great big script file and run it through the CLI and let it stand up a QA for me or something. But
Well, that's what I was wondering when you were talking about, like, the DB configure, like, do maybe most people just do it via API or something, or it's just more?
I would imagine I would assume.
That sounds awful, like, sitting there trying to.
It is
basically
awful.
click it through.
It's as awful as it sounds. It's as awful as you're imagining. I would assume that most shops of that scale with that kind of investment are absolutely automating this. Whether they're doing that through templates or through the CLI or what, you would have to. You would absolutely have to. But once again, you're talking about people who are supporting a product, and this is their product. 20 engineers on this product, and we're supporting it for years. We have 20 engineers turning over 30 to 40 projects a year. So we do not have a lot of projects where it's like, oh, we're now going to spend 2 weeks of your money completely automating standing this stuff up for you, right? Nobody wants to pay for it, especially at an early stage of their life cycle for their company or for their product.
You guys mentioned IoT a couple times.
Mhm.
I know in Azure, they've been hubs in Event-Grid. Is there anything similar in AWS?
AWS IoT, I cannot say how it compares to Azure, because I haven't done an Azure IoT project yet. I have one of those little Azure Sphere boards for the Sphere work, and I've kind of dinked around with that a little bit. The AWS IoT overall was pretty cool, honestly. Once you have a device that's talking, you got to install certs. So since there's certs, that's terrible. But once you get the certs working, everything's done through queuing, MQTT, to send messages back and forth. It's actually a really nice model where the IoT device talks to a shadow state. It publishes events, queue messages to this shadow state, and then your entire application listens to that same shadow state. And it's that single point where all of those interactions occur. You basically update the shadow state, and then the device accepts it. The device reports its shadow state, your application can respond to those changes. And once we got that up and working, it was pretty cool. One real cool thing was you can just spin up a Node.js script, put a cert, set up a thing in the AWS portal, and you can just have a thing in code. And you can debug it and run it, and you can watch your application respond to it, because it's all queued messages. It's all topics. That's the only form of communication.
So you're emulating your endpoints?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. That was very handy to handle a couple of IoT-specific oddities we were running into. Maybe Azure IoT is awesome. I don't know. I hope it is, but
I think, is that, like on the AWS side, is that built on top of like Kinesis?
I think so.
Something
Yeah,
else.
you get a Kinesis bill when you start doing IoT stuff, so it's one of the core underlying services for that.
All right, anybody have any other questions, or have we completely answered every question that you ever had about AWS?
Literally explained AWS. We're good. Okay.
You just convinced everybody to not do anything about it.
That wasn't really.
Scared everybody out of it.
I hope it was also clear that there are some good things there and some definite advantages. As a Microsoft developer, that's not my first choice. I feel like where I just end up using Azure and Microsoft's products, I end up in a better place.
So if AWS is cheaper, which I think it probably is, right? And then-
I would say,
On a monthly basis,
yeah.
do you think that by paying more with Azure, you gain enough benefit to make up that?
I think so, but I'm the consultant charging you, like,
Right.
right? You know, I'm not the one paying your credit card bill.
Yeah.
Personally, as somebody who wrote this code and understands what the life cycle of this application and understands maintenance costs down the road, yeah, I would still say it's worth it in most cases. But it's not my credit card bill.
So, we're now talking cost. AWS, Apple for Apple, is not Apple for Apple, is what you're saying. So your net cost for AWS is gonna be how much less versus your additional cost for
Sure.
development and.
Sure.
Those things are hard to quantify.
Those things are really hard to quantify to a customer, right? But you're right, those exist, those are very real too, right? If I spend 15% more time fighting with AWS than I did with Azure at an hourly rate over the course of a 6-month project, how long does it take to amortize those extra hours I spent on saving on your Amazon bill? Like, there are charts you could do in Excel that would say, no, actually, it's not worth it. You're not actually saving money, but.
I'll offer a different point of view.
Go
I
ahead.
work for a startup. I've been, for the most part of 2 years, been a single developer supporting all of IT for the company. My monthly bill on AWS is about a third of what it would be in Azure.
Yeah.
What you're saying about the usability of setting things up, absolutely true. AWS is painful to get things set up and running right. But at a third the cost per month, I'm a huge ROI on that investment.
Yeah, if you're set up, if you're eating the pain of that setup once, and then you're saving 2/3 over the course of years, yeah, that's real money. Absolutely it is. And, you know, those are the balances, right? There's compromises everywhere from that
Yeah,
stuff.
because I think of long term, okay, I'm gonna have updates to my product and redeploying, how much more is it gonna take to deploy again?
And once again, everything we've complained about, I am very confident is a solvable problem in AWS. But that's not the default state we ended up in. If we were on a project where we were gonna be supporting it for 5 years, we would solve those problems. At what cost? I don't know. You know, I don't know how many dollars it would take us to solve those problems, but we would solve those problems and get there. When we have a startup coming to us and they have enough runway for us to do 3 months of development, and then we have to be done, because now they have to go sell the thing, get it set up and go. You know, hopefully they come back to us, right? Hopefully they go make some sales and they come back for further enhancements and we get an opportunity to partner with them and work. But that definitely does not always happen. And you gotta have a thing to sell before you can worry about a thing to optimize. Yeah, and a lot of this is driven by our kind of client,
Okay.
which is very different than people who work for a really big company with many people on a given team supporting these huge applications over a long period of time. That's a really different situation.
I'm gonna take a link to probably the biggest customer anybody could ever want. Right, which is being fought over by Microsoft and Amazon right now. It's in the bidding process. And that's the US government. Right. And you're saying that there's a lot of pain here in the AWS world. I know Amazon, or Microsoft. You want a great development, deployment, everything, it's all there, right? So, will government customers be willing to go through that pain? Or will there be something developed for them to do
Well,
their deployments?
I think, you know, like Tony said, like, you know, for us, like when we're developing something for a customer, we're making, you know, greedy optimizations of what is, you know, 2 feet in front of us. We're not looking at stuff that's, you know, how it's gonna evolve over 5 years worth of time or anything like that. So, you know, if we were planning on building something that was gonna be running for a long period of time and we're gonna be enhancing it, supporting it, maintaining it that whole time, for early on, we would take those pains of deployment and we would automate those. I mean, I'm sure, like you said, so your costs are about 1/3 on AWS. You've probably solved the deployment issues for what you're doing, right? It probably took you a little bit of time to get a good feel for it, but once you got the deployment story figured out, you don't have to worry about it anymore, right?
And you can script most of the
Right.
AWS CLI.
Yeah.
But you-
Documentation's a challenge.
Right.
What you do, you can script.
And you've been working on the same product for 2 years.
Yep.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to do that if I was doing 30 projects a year.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah.
30 setups a year would be painful.
Right. Yep.
What parts of the AWS was, because I'm sure not everything was 1/3, some were probably more than 1/3, some were less than.
I mean, first of all, our Windows server is dirt cheap compared to hosting on Azure.
Okay.
But we use a lot of different tools. We have streaming video, we've got S3 storage, we've got Docker containers hosted on Fargate, we've got the Elastic Beanstalk Windows Server instances, and Aurora DB. And the price for performance on that is spectacular. To even whip up a test environment in AWS, or I'm sorry, in Azure to compare, I blow through my monthly cost just on a small test environment. And parts of it that are not as price competitive, but if you're looking at Fargate, looking at the database, looking at video streaming, those parts are substantially cheaper than you'll find.
Yeah, I can't speak to all those specific services, but that sounds right. I believe that, totally.
You guys ever thought about doing like a best of breed kind of scenario where you combine the two together?
Well, we did the opposite of that, where we built a mostly .NET app, and then we went and used SNS, Simple Notification Services, to do push notifications. And then after we did that, Matt said you shouldn't have done that because Microsoft's App Center, their mobile App Center, apparently has really great push notification stuff that's way simpler than Simple Notification Services. But we had just done notification services. They're incredibly cheap. It's like pennies per millions of push notifications. It's practically free, right? To just send all these push notifications. Send all you want. You'll barely even see it on your bill. But the SDK for that was kind of rough for device registration. Documentation was not super clear, and it was pretty painful to set it up. But yeah, we've talked about, what if we did mostly do Azure, but then we used DynamoDB to get a super cheap non-relational data store? I would not be opposed to that. I would not be fundamentally opposed to that, right? I'm not going to tell a customer or even tell, one of my devs, I'm not going to say, no, we are all in this platform or we are all in this platform and we will never mix. Never say never. I could see I could see reasons to go across the lines.
Yeah, like the API gateway would be another thing. Like if I was developing a project and they said, you have to use the Azure API gateway, I would balk at that and push as hard as I could, even just to be able to use that one piece in AWS, just because it's that much easier to work with, at least in my experiences.
About the .NET SDKs to integrate with AWS, or do you find that they're pretty intuitive and easy to use?
Yeah, they're okay.
They're all NuGet packages?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're all NuGet packages, and like Tony was saying, the tools that they built into, to add into Visual Studio are great. I can have a sidebar that lets me go in and browse through my subscription and see, all my different Elastic Beanstalk instances and what my different environments within a Beanstalk environment is doing.
The AWS extension for Visual Studio is pretty impressive. I'm kind of amazed how much work they must have put into that. Obviously, they have a lot of .NET developers using their infrastructure, because otherwise, I can't imagine going to that kind of effort to build and maintain that thing.
And they've built out a good number of templates as well for,
Yeah.
moving up a project.
Nice.
All right. Well, thanks for all the questions and
Yeah, thanks for having us here. And,
Yeah.
Thanks, guys.